We all have gifts, different. That's what we heard about in Romans. I don't have that gift. I got different gifts. Teaching, I think, was in there. So how many people here shop at Whole Foods? Anybody shop at Whole Foods? Anybody want to confess that they shop at Whole Foods? But one of the reasons we shop at Whole Foods is not only because of the products, but because we know they do good in the community. They do good in what they do, and even as they make money, they're doing good. How many people here have ever bought Tom's shoes? Tom's or any, you've heard of Tom's, right? You buy a pair of shoes, and then part of the proceeds of the profit goes to help put shoes on somebody else somewhere else in the world. And so this has become known as ethical consumerism or conscious capitalism. That's what they're calling it in Howard County right now. If you've been following any of the downtown development in Columbia, there's a big push towards conscious capitalism. That's why Whole Foods is there in Columbia now. And so part of this is that this idea that as we consume, we're also doing good. Now, I think this is actually a good idea. I think, I like the idea of part of the money that I spend going to help somebody else. Yet notice that this is, one thing I would point out is this is a luxury of the wealthy. You're not going to find Whole Foods in Sandtown, Baltimore. So that's one thing to note. And so there's the ability, we have an ability in Howard County to practice this conscious capitalism or this ethical consumerism. Yet, do we need to spend and consume to make a difference in the world? To be living sacrifices? That would be my question this morning. And in fact, I can make a difference in somebody else's life without buying a pair of shoes. I can make a difference in somebody else's life without shopping at Whole Foods. In fact, I could give everything or all of it to that person somewhere else. That would be a living sacrifice. Mark Sagoff in his book, The Economy of the Earth, says this: I love my car, I hate the bus. Yet I vote for candidates who promise to tax gasoline to pay for public transportation. I send my dues to the Sierra Club to protect areas in Alaska I'll never visit. I have an Ecology Now sticker on my car that drips oil everywhere it's parked. See, we have these aspirations. We want to do good, but we don't always want to behave in the way that will actually change the world. But somehow maybe our consumerism is not so much about changing the world as it is about making ourselves feel better about spending. And so there's that little piece in there, isn't it? So I'm not saying don't do it or that that's a bad thing altogether, but I think we need to check our motives and what it really means to be a living sacrifice and what it means to live sacrificially for other people and to do good and to change the world around us. That's what Paul's talking about in Romans. That's what Paul's calling us to. And in Romans chapter 1, chapter 12, we get that great therefore. Paul loves that word. If you've been reading Romans, therefore, which means therefore. That means everything that I just talked about in the first 11 chapters of this letter, I'm getting to the therefore now. I'm now getting to it. Paul likes to, he's a good preacher, Keeps going on. So that's where we're at, this therefore. So remember the triangle we started out with at the beginning of the series. I talked about our relationship to God, our relationship to other people, and how these all interact and intersect. The first 11 chapters, actually the first 8 chapters, Paul's been talking about our relationship to God and God's grace and God's love and sin in our lives, and how when we allow God's grace to work in us, the Holy Spirit to work in us, it changes our relationship with God. Now Paul's beginning with the rest of the book of Romans, which we will finish this summer. I just skipped 3 chapters. That's how we're doing it. So we're going to move into our relationship to others. We're going to stop looking as much at the vertical relationship and start looking at our horizontal relationship to other people. And that's what Paul's talking about as he says, therefore, be a living sacrifice. That living sacrifice that you and I become, that God wants us to be, impacts our relationship to other people. And that's what he says. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as living sacrifices, as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Now, Paul says this in Rome. He's talking to Roman Christians who lived in a city of sacrifice. But what kind of sacrifices do you think they were offering in the city of Rome? They weren't living sacrifices, they were dead sacrifices. They were animal sacrifices to this god or that god, or trying to win the favor of this particular god in that temple, or going over to this temple and practicing another act of service or worship in that temple, or offering this sacrifice over here to try and appease the gods. And so Paul says, into this culture of dead sacrifice, he says the Christian is to be a living sacrifice. That means you don't kill yourself, but you actually live for God. You offer your whole self as a living sacrifice to God. And that's not just on Sunday, that's every day of the week. To be a living sacrifice, to be an alive sacrifice, and a sacrifice that gives life to other people. I've seen a lot of dead sacrifices in my days in the church. I've seen some servant-hearted people in the church that aren't very living in their service. They're dead in their service. They serve, but their attitude and it expresses something else. I remember an usher in one of the churches I served. It was an older church. This is how old the church was. They didn't have screens. They didn't use bulletins. They had these two boards on either side, and on that they would post the hymn numbers. Anybody ever remember growing up in a church like that? And yeah, Glenmore used to be okay. Not anymore. So, and they were like that. And then, so this guy would take 10 minutes out of his Saturday evening. Every Saturday, one of our ushers, he would come in, he would get the copy of the bulletin, and he'd go and he'd get a ladder out and he'd change the numbers. Sometimes I'd be there Saturday night, and I'd run into him, and he wasn't a living sacrifice. He was a complaining sacrifice. He complained about having to change the numbers again. Why can't we just sing what we sang last week, Pastor? I got to come over here for 10 minutes every Saturday night and change the numbers. I said, well, you could come in early Sunday morning and change them. Well, I don't want to have to do that. So then he would get there Sunday morning and he grabbed a stack of bulletins. Here you go, here you go, here you go. No smile, no joy. And then he complained because we ran out of bulletins. Like that's a bad thing in a church to run out of bulletins. Like we got so many people coming in here, we run out of bulletins. And then he complained because it'd be too hot or it'd be too cold in the sanctuary. And then so he'd have to blame the trustees and complain about the trustees. And then we'd go over to the thermostat and adjust it because the trustees weren't doing their job. This went on every week. I was like, what are you doing? You're not being a living sacrifice. It was like, I'm going to serve, but I'm going to be a martyr about it. Look how awful my life is. Look how awful my service is. I should get some credit for all this. That's not a living sacrifice. A living sacrifice serves because of their joy and their gratitude to God, because of God's grace at work in their life. Their service is a response to grace and gratitude and love of God for them. You ready for your Greek lesson this morning? I'm not feeling it. I'm not feeling the enthusiasm. I'm not feeling the cheerfulness, the living sacrifice from you this morning, the aliveness. So here's your two Greek words this morning. The first one is logikos. Logikos. What does that sound like in English? Logic, right. Different ways to translate. This is the word that gets translated spiritual, but it literally means informed, rational, intelligent, of mind and heart, reasonable. Those are other ways to translate, and those are actually more literal translations of that word, and we get the word logic. So it's not as much spiritual as it is logical or informed or reasonable act of worship. The next word is the word that we translate here, worship, but it's latreion, which means service. So why is Paul using the word service? Because when you go to a temple in Rome, your act of service would be your sacrifice, okay? So you have to put this all together. That's why it gets translated spiritual worship. But I'm going to offer you the Matt Poole paraphrase version or the Matt Poole translation of these two words. Instead of translating it spiritual worship, here's what I would offer you to think about it. To translate it, that it's your informed by grace act of service. And the reason I say that fits better is because we're talking about being living sacrifices. And our sacrifices and our living sacrifice is an act of service, is an act of worship that is informed by God's grace in our lives. And so it's a response to God's love and grace for us. Remember the triangle? our relationship to God, grace, love towards us, that now we extend that grace and love to other people. We become living sacrifices for others. So that's what we're to be doing. That's our worship, and that's to happen every day of our life. Worship is not just an hour on Sunday, it's every day. As we serve, we worship. As we worship, we serve. Then Paul goes on and writes, and believe me, folks, I wish you'd give me about 2 more weeks just to unpack these 2 verses. But the next verse he says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Romans 12:2. This renewal of the mind. That transformation has to do with us renewing our minds. Our logikos, logic, intelligence, rational, reasonable. So how does that work? I've used this model before. It's called a SelfTalk Model. We teach it to our caring ministers as they pray and listen with people who need care. But one of the things that we all know about about us being human is that we have beliefs about the world around us. We have beliefs about people. And those beliefs and assumptions impact the way we think and the way we think about situations and other people or circumstances in our lives. And those thoughts then lead to us to either have good feelings or negative feelings about those thoughts. Those thoughts lead to those feelings. And then those feelings will result in our action. So, for example, I was at a cafeteria last summer with my daughter, and we were trying to get lunch. So, as we're trying to get lunch, we're in a place of a lot of other people from a lot of different countries. And in the United States, the cultural expectation when you're ordering food is that you stand in line. In other countries, you do not stand in line. So everybody keeps cutting in front of my daughter to get to their lunch. You know, they just keep going in and ordering, and my daughter's waiting there politely, kindly, like we've taught her to. And she's doing what she's expected to do. That's what she expects. And all these other people have different expectations, and they're coming in. And they're cutting her off. And so I'm thinking, this isn't right. So how do I feel about this situation? I'm feeling a little frustrated. So what's my action? I stand in the back and I say, there's a line over here. Say it loud enough for everybody to hear, to which I was promptly ignored. Because, one, I'm speaking a foreign language, and there are different cultural expectations at work, and so I just get ignored, and this keeps happening. And so so there's my action. Now I have to adjust my belief about the situation or about other people, right? So then I start to think, it's just different. There's nothing wrong going on here. It's just different. These folks don't know that this is the cultural expectation. They're living out of their own cultural expectations. It's just different. So then I begin to say, okay, I'm going to change my thinking about this. I get less frustrated as a result, and I say to my daughter, just go up there. Just jump in there. You're not going to get lunch unless you just jump in and be a little bit more assertive and just go with the flow, so to speak, and we'll get your food and we'll go. So she's like, you sure, Dad? I'm like, just jump in. Just go, So that changed. Do you see how that changed the script? So I think we all need to learn to do that. To change those scripts, those stereotypes, those things. But that's part of renewing the mind. So here's what Paul's talking about. What would that look like here in Romans chapter 12? Well, our belief through the first 11 chapters of Romans is that grace has been extended to us. Grace has been poured out into us. What's my response to grace? It's amazing. We even got a hymn called Amazing Grace. That's how amazing it is. So my thought about grace is, wow, God gave Christ. God poured love and grace into my life. Oh my gosh, this is wonderful. This is amazing. Then I begin to feel what? Grateful for that grace. That's been changed my life, changed my heart, changed my mind, transformed me. So I become grateful for what God has done in my life. And as a result, I am to be a living sacrifice. It's easier to be a living sacrifice when you have a clear view of grace. Have you ever not wanted to come to church to worship? Come on, confess. I can tell you I have, and I'm the pastor. There are mornings I don't want to get up, come to worship. But you know what I'm not thinking about when I feel that way? I'm not thinking about God's grace. Because as soon as I get clear about God's grace in my life, I want to serve. I want to respond to it. I want to make a difference in the world. I want to become that living sacrifice because I am reminded of God's grace. I think that's one of the reasons the church gathers on Sunday, is to remind ourselves of how God has poured grace and love into our lives in Jesus Christ. And so that changes the script. That renews the mind. That transforms us so that we can be these living sacrifices informed by grace and serving the world. You know, that ought to change us. But you know, what's got to happen for that change to happen is something that the church has called surrender. And that's the thing that's not in that model, is the will. And at some point, your will and my will needs to be surrendered to God's will. That's what Paul says, to discern the will of God. That you and I have to surrender our loyalty, our control, our will to God's will if that transformation is going to happen. E. Stanley Jones, a famous Methodist missionary, put it this way. He said, so to change your outlook, your thinking, you have to change your central loyalties. Self-surrender is the profoundest change of loyalty that one can make. Christ, not you, is the central loyalty. See, that's the point. You know, in ethical consumerism, I'm still in it. I'm still benefiting from it. I'm still getting something from it. I'm still just being loyal to who? Me. What I want. How I want to spend my money. But at some point, I've got to totally surrender it all. I've got to surrender the self and take the self out of it to allow this transformation into a living sacrifice to happen. I've got to surrender my loyalty to the world, to consumerism, to other things, to even my own feelings and thoughts sometimes, so that I can make Christ the central loyalty of my life. I have to surrender to do that. Jesus said, what does it profit a person if they gain the whole world and lose their soul? You have to be willing to lose self to find yourself. It's counterintuitive, folks. It doesn't make sense to us. Yet Jesus, God, Paul says, if you will do that, you will find yourself. You will find what life is really all about. And then you will begin to do God's will. And what is God's will? Well, God's will is that we love. That's ultimately God's will, you know, and that's what Paul goes on. He talks about spiritual gifts, and he says you use your spiritual gifts not for your own benefit, but for the benefit of others, to grow others, to help others to grow in grace and love of God as well. That our gifts are given to us in proportion to our grace and our faith as we grow and mature in our faith. And I don't have time to unpack all that. We'll get to that at some point. And then it's also to be used to grow others, to help them in their relationship with God, that we're using our gifts to serve others, that we become living sacrifices, serving acts of service to help others grow and to experience God's grace and love. So I want to close with this question and actually alert you to what's next in chapter 12. But the question is this: do you love the church? Do you love the church? Not all the time. There are imperfections in the church. There are imperfections in every church. There are imperfections in every denomination. But if we really say that the church is not a steeple or a building, it's the what? People. If the church is the people, do we love God's people? Do we love God's people enough to want to see them grow and thrive and live in grace and be living sacrifices? Are we willing to make the investment to help them do that? Are we willing to do that, because the next thing that Paul says in Romans chapter 12 is, let love be genuine. Hate what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with mutual affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. That's what he says to the church in Rome. Love each other. Commit to being loving, choosing love, as our bumper sticker says. Be living sacrifices for each other and for the world around you. Be informed by God's grace, despite all the imperfections. My wife and I will celebrate 25 years this week, and when we, no, you don't need to clap. Clap for her when you see her, but no, clap for me. So 25 years, and I like to mess with do y'all mess with your spouses, ever mess with them? Like, when I mean mess with them, like joke around with, I mess with my wife. And so she was saying, well, it's 25 years, what gift do you get for the 25th anniversary, right? I'm saying, well, that's our wooden anniversary. Maybe aluminum, I don't know, honey, but it's either wood or aluminum, I don't know, because I'm starting to, just mess around, like, I'll get you a piece of wood or something forever, just teasing her. And then, so we're trying to figure out, what's 25th, what's 50th. And then she goes, well, isn't it the diamond anniversary? And I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. So I immediately turn to my iPhone and Google 75th anniversary to find out what it is. That's the diamond anniversary, and I come up with 75th anniversary. I'm like, whew, I'm off the hook. I said, honey, at 75, I'll get you a diamond. And she laughed. And then I did the calculation in my head. I'll be 98 if I make it. And I thought about that. How are we going to be married for another 50 years? How does that work? How does that happen? I think it happens by being a living sacrifice. I think it happens by choosing to love this other person despite their imperfections. The question that I would ask for the next 50 years is not, honey, do you love me? But the question I need to ask as a spouse is, how do I love? I think when it comes to the church and we say, sometimes we come to the church or we come to God and we say, God, do you love me? Church, do you love me? The Christian question is not, do you love me? They already know the answer to that question. The answer is yes. That's what Paul's been talking about, grace, love. The answer is, does the God love me? Yes. Does the church love me? That's a good question for some people. But the Christian doesn't ask the question, do you love me? The Christian asks the question, how can I love? How can I make a difference? How can I be this living sacrifice? How can I allow God's grace to flow through me to other people and make a difference in this world? How can I love? And that's what Jesus said was the greatest commandment. Love God, love your neighbor. Amen.